Texas went 7-3 last year. They lost close to TCU, to Oklahoma in a couple overtimes, and then Iowa State, a game in which they did not trail until the last 1 minute and 44 seconds of the game.
I remember that game very clearly, yeah.
So I think it's worth underscoring, worth emphasizing that this was not a bad team. They just weren't good enough to get over that hump, to find that extra gear, and ultimately to retain Tom Herman. It always felt like we were waiting for them to find that next level, and that's kind of been the case ever since, I guess, Mac Brown left, or shortly before Mac Brown left. We knew that there was a ton of potential in Texas because there are a million built-in advantages. It's a very rich athletic program, to say the least. But to find that next level has really been the unicorn. That's what they're after, and it's what they have not been able to do. 7-3, despite the close losses. We could talk a little bit about what Texas's identity was as a football program under Tom Herman, but we'll get there. The point here is they didn't find that next level. They decided to go a different direction. And that new direction is going to be Steve Sarkeesian, who comes over from Alabama. We'll talk about what I think he brings to the equation. What I'm hopeful that they can get away from is what we saw last year, which was a case of mistaken or poorly defined identity. And by that, I mean, how many times did we talk on this show about Texas building the entire plane out of Sam Ehlinger?
A lot of shallow crosses, a lot of you take the good, you take the bad, long-time starter. And at one point, I think I used the terminology of 2020 and opted out of having strong thoughts about Texas football because the losses seemed the same and the wins seemed the same.
I think that's exactly right. And so from afar, it felt like everything ran through Ehlinger. And he was a good college quarterback. He had a lot of heart. He was an easy guy to root for, but they just relied way too much on him. Everybody wanted to see more of Bijan Robinson, who set a school record with 8.2 yards per carry, went over 100 yards in 3 of the last 4 games. Perhaps if he would have gotten the ball more, it would have been a bit of a different story for Tom Herman. That did not come to fruition. But Bijan Robinson is going to be a talking point as we move forward into 2021. Defensively, they weren't great at stopping the pass. They weren't great at generating pressure. They really weren't great at tackling, which is kind of a problem for a defense. Bill Connolly graded them 116th in the nation when it came to tackling. And that was with some really talented guys like Joseph Osai, Juwan Mitchell, Caden Stearns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the problem for Texas is not a talent thing. The problem for Texas is an organization thing and an identity thing. And so now enter new coach Steve Sarkisian. At the time they hired Sarkisian, I remember, because I actually went back and listened to some of what we said about it. I was not all that excited about the Sarkisian hire. It didn't feel like it had enough sex appeal to me. And I don't know why that is, because Sarkisian's a big name. He comes over from Bama. He's obviously gotten plenty of head coaching experience in his times with Washington and USC, and now most recently at the highest levels of being an assistant under Nick Saban. But for my money, it didn't feel like firing Tom Herman to get Steve Sarkisian was a great move. I feel like I've kind of come around on that. And it could be because of the YouTube clips that you sent me with Steve Sarkeesian explaining how he coaches to other coaches. You know what I mean? You remember what I mean?
That's not his job right now. Even though he is in charge of the offense, his job is much bigger in scope than that. I feel like with the benefit of some research, with the benefit of added reading, I have come around on that Sarkeesian hire. I think it was a good move. I love the fact that he's using the all gas, no brakes hashtag on Twitter, because that's a thing that we've said for the last couple of years. I ran my mouth, a month ago now, about being all in on Texas. I think I'm past the point of no return. So here is the case for Texas. Okay.
The case for Texas is this, and it's always hard with them because you have to temper the talent and the built-in advantages with, in this case, the fact that they've got a new coach coming in. But I'm excited him coming over from Alabama because everybody wants to be Alabama right now. And he put a really solid coaching staff together. It's clear that he understands what he needs. I'm not going to go through everyone, but bringing over Kyle Flood, to coach up the offensive line, to help coach on the offense. That was a big deal. He also got Pete Kwiatkowski,
Coach
from Washington, to run the defense. He mixes in a whole bunch of different fronts. He has a track record for putting together really good red zone defenses. Both these guys have a track record for putting forth units that play hard.
Sure.
And I think that's worth getting excited about. Not that Texas was dogging it last year, but if you're installing a new culture, you got to start there. And the other thing I think worth noting is that it's not like the cupboard is bare. The second big reason to be excited here is that he's got a veteran team. Sark does, with 15 starters back, 8 on one side of the ball on offense, 7 on the other. I have to believe that the first order of business is going to be game planning how to get Bijan Robinson the ball more. Heaven knows why Tom Herman didn't. I don't know if anyone's asked him. I haven't looked. But this is an offensive line that's got 4 guys back. Ideally, Kyle Flood is building around that line and hopefully pulling a reverse Ehlinger in that he's not asking the quarterback to win all the games for him. He's going to be a little bit more reliant on, I think, one of the elite backs in college football. So I'm excited about those two things. Those two things first and foremost. The coaching staff gives me a lot of confidence, and also the returning pool of talent. It's Texas. How could you not be excited about that? So, that said, there are questions here. I think it's Casey Thompson at quarterback. It could be Hudson Card. Yeah. But I think it's Casey Thompson. He was really good in limited action last year. Had 6 touchdowns, to no interceptions. Probably the favorite. Sark hasn't said yet which direction he's going to go, but that's going to be a spot to watch. The other thing is defensively, they've only got 2 starters back up front, but there's a lot of depth with experience. I'm pretty pumped about Alfred Collins. He's 6'5", 305. I propose we call him Big Al.
Happily.
I've always wanted to call somebody Big Al on this show, and we've never had that opportunity. I think this is the one.
Okay. I'm with
Big Al Collins. So here's my thing. My thing is that Sark enters into this situation with a unique opportunity to, I think, work with talent that's already there, to very quickly come in and establish an identity. I don't hope that it's going to take long for him to do that. I think we will start to see some immediate returns, but we just have to be mindful of the fact that these things often do not click right away. Despite all the talent.
Right.
It sometimes takes a while to click. When it does, it can be great, but we need to at least give him enough wiggle room that if he doesn't go down to Austin and start winning right away, that's okay. And that's like, we need to give ourselves the permission structure to just accept that, Dan.
But it almost seems like with who's returning, right? So you have at least a couple quarterbacks, Casey Thompson and Hudson Card, that came in with that blue chip pedigree. That, I remember seeing pieces about Hudson Card and his arm talent and can make all the throws and is somebody who can throw off platform, all this, lofty comparisons. And Casey Thompson is older and more seasoned. We saw his performance in the bowl game, I believe, against Colorado, just absolutely shredding the Buffs, which it's Colorado. It's okay. And so whoever it is, they have experience as a college quarterback. They're not being asked as a true freshman to come in and immediately dominate. But the pieces around with the experience along the offensive line, with the receivers who are healthier, and Bijan Robinson, of course, and a defense that should more than hold their own, it's almost like this year might be really good, and then it might change next year and the year after when it's fewer inherited players, right? This is an ideal situation, aside from, obvious game breakers. There are potential game breakers at receiver, but that he doesn't inherit like 1,000-yard receiver immediately. So you could see good early returns and then a second chapter kind of thing as well.
It happens. Yeah. And look, I think despite the fact that most of the attention is going to be on the offense, I'm really curious to see what happens on the defensive side of the ball.
Sure.
Texas, the tackling thing, it should be obvious as a defensive unit, but if they weren't good at doing the fundamentals, it's going to make everything else harder. Sure. They do have depth up front. DeMarvion Overshown is healthy at linebacker. He's going to anchor a good linebacking core. Both corners are back in the secondary. So there's a lot to work with. It really is a lot to work with, and I think there could be some good early returns. That said, this is not an easy schedule. It is not an easy schedule. It's 11th most difficult in the country. They open against Louisiana, which I've talked about a couple shows ago now. I don't think that's a picnic. Week 1 against a really veteran team that's got a strong identity. They should beat them, but don't sleep on Louisiana. Just saying.
I mean,
that follows.
They beat Iowa State last year. That's something.
Beat Iowa State last year, yeah. They follow that one up, a road game against Arkansas. Then they've got a 3-week stretch beginning at the beginning of October where they go to TCU. You're just
glossing over at Arkansas.
I am glossing over
I think that's a crazy losable game. Continue.
Well, then there's 2 games. Then there's 2 games right in a row that are weirdly losable. They follow that up at TCU, home against, neutral site, against Oklahoma, and then home against Oklahoma State on 3 consecutive weeks. And then there's a huge game later in the year on the road at Iowa State. So this is not easy for Sark in year 1. Vegas has the number at 8, and most folks are hitting the under, which I think I understand. I understand that.
Yeah, I could see it. I mean, by the way, you mentioned at Iowa State. It's a week after they play at Baylor, who I think should be improved as well. So I'm just in terms of streakiness, right?
Sure. We'll get to Baylor.
We'll get to Baylor, whatever. But I'm saying Baylor is not a nothing program. It's not a nothing team. It's not a walkover, don't even mention them kind of program. So 2 straight road games against legit programs is something. And then, so they have, last year they win in a losing effort against Oklahoma State, and they have that a week after the Cotton Bowl game against OU. They've lost a bunch to TCU, and they go on the road, right? It's in Fort Worth this year. So I think they're 3-7 in the last decade and got run all over. You mentioned the tackling issues. That was maybe never more clear than against TCU on the ground last year in that loss. Yep. So no, it's entirely tricky, this schedule, just especially in terms of the teams that they play consecutively with no buffer type situations. Later in the season, it's a little, I think at West Virginia is going to be extremely tough. It should be another good Mountaineer defense, and Kansas State should be healthier. So no, Texas is going to need to be on its A game almost immediately with this schedule.
From a raw talent standpoint, the only team on the schedule that is significantly better is Oklahoma. And that's the rivalry. So I say that because if Sark can get things better organized quickly, they could get to 9-3. The team is good enough to get to 9-3. It's good enough to do better than that, frankly. But I just think it's too much to ask with a new coach coming in. Even though it's been more of a normal offseason, I'll give him 9-3. I'm excited to see what Sark can do, but too many questions for me to go much higher than that. I would go over 8, though. I would go over 8.
Yeah, and it was still a Louisiana team that got pushed around some on the ground last year. So an ideal opener for the Texas ground game and ground attack, in that they won't be necessarily comparable talent-wise up front to what Texas is offering or should offer.